For those of you unfamiliar with PS21, Portsmouth Smart Growth for the 21st Century is an independent, volunteer-led nonprofit that presents ideas and encourages discussion around planning issues in Portsmouth and around the seacoast. Our goal is to support a vibrant, sustainable, livable, and walkable community consistent with the principles of smart growth, the historic nature of Portsmouth, in the context of the 21st century. And you can find out more information about PS21. You can watch videos of our past events, and of course you can make donations at ps21.info. And you can also follow us, PS21, on Facebook and on Twitter. PS21's next event is going to be called Paris to Portsmouth. It's going to be in April, and it's focusing on measures that the citizens and the city of Portsmouth can target to help our community take on the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. PS21 events are free and open to the public. We rely on the generosity of our sponsors and your donations to bring internationally known speakers like Brent Toderian to Portsmouth. PS21 would especially like to thank our sponsors for this evening who made this event possible. Our lead event sponsor is New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, who really helped make this event possible for us. And other event sponsors include Piscataqua Savings Bank, Old Port Properties, and the New Hampshire Planners Association. And we had event partners helping with the event, including Plan New Hampshire, 3S Artspace, Seacoast Media Group, GDI Design, and the Northern New England chapter of the American Planning Association. The topic of density done well is particularly relevant to our community as Portsmouth is in the midst of significant growth, and with it, a spirited dialogue about the nature of development and the shaping of the city in the future. PS21 seeks to strengthen these conversations by presenting new ideas and challenging prevailing assumptions. A practitioner and thought leader with over 25 years of experience in advanced urbanism, city planning, and urban design, Brent Toderian has advised and collaborated with cities, agencies, and best practice developers around the world. He is the founding president of the Council for Canadian Urbanism and writes for the Huffington Post, Planetizen, CityLab, and SPACING. Brent's establishment of Toderian Urban Works in early 2012 followed 6 years of significant achievement as Vancouver's chief planner, with accomplishments that included the eco-density and greenest city initiatives, new waterfront and skyline shaping strategies, new visions and strategies for the city's viaducts, multimodal. Well, I'll skip to the end. He's worked on intensive strategies for the downtown city and regional levels, emphasizing a complete city, not just a livable one, which I'd like to emphasize, and oversaw development, design, and architecture in Vancouver, known internationally as a city by design. So, without going through the entire list of his accomplishments to shorten the evening, please help me to welcome Brent Toderian.
I send that long bio for print, not to be read out loud at the beginning. Sorry, I forgot to give you the short version. Thank you for the invitation. This is my second trip to Portsmouth. The first time I was here was in the 1990s when I was in my 20s. So I wasn't at all sure if my memory of the place, which was very positive, I should say, was accurate, because we all know how memory works. But so I was very glad to have an excuse to come back. And it's been a little bit in coming. I think we tried last year and couldn't quite make the timing and such work, so I'm glad we managed to try it again and make it happen. And I'm particularly happy because, according to the news this morning, your president is about to launch a trade war with Canada, so I might not have another chance, depending on how long that goes. That was good. Oh. Okay. I wasn't sure how to address the topic of density done well, which, by the way, I think the advertisement said it was my signature topic. I didn't think I had a signature topic, but I certainly do like talking about density because it's a very tough thing to talk about. And most of the time we talk about it very poorly, or at best very superficially. And that's been the subject of a lot of conversations I've had with some of your local folks all day today. So it's been a very busy day, a very jam-packed day. And has allowed me to, I think, organize my thoughts, hopefully organize my thoughts a little better so that what I'm going to talk about tonight has evolved based on what I've seen, heard, and learned and listened to from many of your leaders and community folks today. But I decided I wanted to get the elephant out from under the table right off the bat. Yes, I was the chief planner of this city, which is a beautiful city, Vancouver, but it's a much denser city, it's a much taller city, it's a much bigger city than you are. And I can't tell you how many times I've had folks in work I'm doing with cities, because I don't speak for a living, I actually am a practitioner. I've had people say to me, well, you know, Portsmouth is nothing like Vancouver, so why are you here? And what could we possibly learn from you? What could you possibly learn from us? And I wanted to get that right out, right off the bat, out from under the table, because what I talk about after 26 years of doing this all over the world in all scales of urban and rural and town scaled places is that there are principles of good city building, town building, that are universal and have nothing to do with how tall your building is. Well, that's a bit of an overstatement. And little to do with the materials you choose, etc. And even not much to do with your context, if you happen to have a beautiful context or a less beautiful context. And I also would note that, yes, this is Vancouver, but so is this. This is Gastown, our original town site, a national historic community. And so in a place that had very weak heritage laws, we've managed to do very creative things with out-of-the-box thinking to preserve relatively intact a remarkable heritage community at a low scale, certainly by our standards, a low scale. You would probably call this high scale, perhaps, in your context, I'm not sure, or at least medium scale. But every place has heritage places, hopefully, if they're planned well. This is a place where I was last month, Kingston, Ontario, which is one of the original cities, original capital of Canada before Ottawa. And I've become their ongoing advisor to help them with issues of density and growth and scale and height in the context of remarkable heritage beauty. And it's not easy, but it is possible, especially if a city wants to achieve all the public interest benefits of well-planned, well-designed growth. And I do say that density is a very positive thing. I am pro-density, if you do it well. And I'm about the most vigorous critic you can find of crappy density, of density done very badly. And I have no problem explaining the difference. So I point this out because I want to make sure that it's understood that even as modern a city is of Vancouver, I probably worked in about 100 different small towns and small cities, mostly with heritage component. And by the way, this is where I'm from. This is Perth, Ontario. The Queen, our Queen. I know you've adopted the royals lately here in the United States, but there are royals, not yours. We're Commonwealth, you're not. This is Perth, Ontario. The Queen called it the prettiest town in North America. It's population 6,000. This is where I grew up before I eventually went off to the big city. So this is your scale. This is the view from my window when I woke up. My hosts actually wanted me to aim the other way towards your north end, your newer development, because I think they were hoping I would be critical. I got a nice view in the morning, but I realized enough about that. Ironically, what I'm talking about is, of course, where we are right now as we do this talk. A wonderful facility, but not a wonderful context in terms of the community around it. I think they were hoping I would tweet something critical right off the bat when I opened my windows and looked out. Because that's what I did a month ago in that other heritage town. I tweeted that this is what I saw when I looked out my window. And I noted that in that incredible heritage context I showed you a few slides ago, they had built some of the worst waterfront buildings I had ever seen anywhere in the world, and I've seen a lot of waterfronts around the world. And I was just thinking I might be a bit provocative, and it ended up on the front page of the paper. But that was a good thing, because in a week of work I was doing my first week with them, it immediately set a context for our conversation that established that I would be truthful. Not as my Aussie clients, I do a lot of work in Australia, not as my Australian clients say, not a wanker, which is what they call an outsider who comes in and kind of insults everything locally, but constructively candid in terms of a willingness to tell the truth of about what's being done well and not being done so well. And I am Canadian, but I am un-Canadian in the sense that I'm not afraid to be critical, and I don't apologize for it after. I don't say sorry. because I do believe in telling truth to power and telling truth to communities. So if this is what I see from my window, I'm going to comment on it. Now, of course, I've spent the day in your wonderful walkable community, and since I'm telling the truth, I can be complimentary because you have a remarkably beautiful heritage, walkable downtown. Notwithstanding that I did tweet this afternoon to say I saw plenty of evidence in the way you do your surface parking, your surface on-street parking, your surface parking lots. And yes, I don't have a power pointer, but in the road widths as well, an observation that you could do a lot more in terms of your people places and your road space, your street space for walking, biking, and public transit. You could make much better use of the space you have between these wonderful heritage buildings if you wanted to, because you're sort of, you're benefiting from this remarkable heritage context you've inherited. You're not necessarily making smart use of the space in between that has been largely the result of more recent decisions from traffic engineers and others. I also spent some time taking a look at some of your controversial issues. You know this building. I'm going to immediately make some enemies, perhaps, and shake your trust in my credibility by saying I don't think this building is all that bad. It's actually, from an urban design and edge relationship perspective, I'm picturing a restaurant underneath there and patio seating coming out in that space. And the actual building itself, it doesn't keep me up at night to think that you're going to have to keep it. Now this, I don't understand. That your federal government would say that's worth keeping, I don't understand. It makes no sense. That should be torn down and create a nice public space or something like that. Nothing heritage merit in that. And if I'm complimenting you and saying things are very nice and you're getting smug, you're also doing this, or you have done this. You've made many of the mistakes that many other cities have done, particularly in your zeal to accommodate the single occupant vehicle most of the time. And both in terms of the parking structures, which are ugly, but the built form adjacent to them, which creates that kind of edge condition that's very oppressive and yet tries to mimic some heritage to make it look like it's good architecture. So you've done things, particularly on some of your edge conditions, that are quite poorly done. And I suspect you know that. Maybe you're more critical of your context than I am. But when I'm having a broad conversation about density, I like to start with, and this is how I did it when I was chief planner of Vancouver, I'm always having a conversation about why we're talking about city building and density at all, and noting that many of the things we are struggling with in terms of our societal challenges are directly tied to how we build and design cities and towns. So whether you're motivated by climate change, and given your context, you sure should be. I know you had flooding in the last couple of days. That's going to be normal, as I'm sure you know, both in terms of sea level rise, but more quickly the frequency and intensity of storm events. Public health epidemics related to preventable diseases directly tied to how we design and plan our cities, and particularly our car dependency. Housing affordability, unpredictable energy costs, aging. I used to say aging, I say changing populations now, because now it's not just the seniors boom, but it's the millennials, the largest demographic group on planet Earth, and the competition cities have to attract and accommodate and retain millennials as they start to raise families. And in all of this context, how do you maintain yourself, your individuality, and not just be the same as every other place in terms of civic and historical identity? So climate change, the United States was behind on this in the global context until, in my observation, Hurricane Sandy, which got the attention of the United States up until recently when you elected a denier. But luckily, the mayors and many of the state levels of government are showing leadership around climate change. But it's going to come down to land use decisions in cities and communities and mobility that is really going to determine whether or not we all are addressing climate change mitigation appropriately. So it's largely in the context of the powers of locals, or in the case of some powers, state levels. And then the public health piece, I've found that the doctors and the public healthcare professionals are probably my most influential allies in the conversation about building and designing better communities lately, because, you know, we don't always listen to our climate scientists, although we should, but we tend to listen to our doctors and our healthcare professionals. So This was a media conference that was held, a media event held by the 4 top public health care officials of 4 counties around Toronto in Canada. And they talked completely about transit and walkable communities and urban biking infrastructure, and how that was the key to not only preventing disease on a societal level, but billions of dollars of saving in public health care costs. And it got a ton of press because it was the doctors. I joked that if the 4 chief planners of those counties had called a press conference, no one would have come. But the doctors get attention. So they are a remarkable ally. In my work in Australia, one of my primary clients in Australia, who has brought me down to work in 5 or 6 cities, I think, of the 9 that I've worked in Australia, to talk about how better planning at the local and state level is critical for healthy communities and reducing healthcare costs, etc. And the client is the Heart Foundation. I'm brought in by the Heart Foundation of Australia to work with state and local governments on how we plan and design communities. And they put out this document, Does Density Matter? The Case for Walkable Communities. You should download this. It is online. You can find it easily, relatively easily, and read it. But I'll give away the ending. Yes, density matters. And if climate change and health don't motivate you, maybe money does. Canada is in the lead, and now Australia, partially because of all the work I'm doing there, in the lead in connecting the dots, doing the math on the remarkable costs associated with infrastructure and such, and how cities, and the United States is in the lead on this, are getting close to bankrupting themselves in terms of the infrastructure costs associated with urban sprawl as opposed to infill and smart growth. And when you do the math on this, I find it might be the most powerful argument of all, because whether you're so-called right-wing or left-wing, billions of dollars really should get your attention, and all the things that that money could be done with that fits your particular ideology if you weren't spending it on infrastructure. One city very analogous in terms of heritage context, etc., to Portsmouth, Halifax, Canada, one of the smaller cities that has done these studies, found that just turning the dial in terms of how much growth goes to infill versus suburban growth, greenfield growth, $3 billion difference in infrastructure over the course of the life of a plan. And that, by the way, was the conservative number. I actually think they didn't come close to calculating everything they could have, but they wanted to be conservative. And yet, you can imagine how that number got the attention of everyone, including the public and politicians of every stripe, which starts to break down this right versus left political narrative to just being about smart or dumb, because this really, whatever your political stripe, that should get your attention. So one of the things I'm saying, cities, suburbs, and towns are changing in their perception of growth, their perception of design, faster than certainly any time in my career lately, not because of an explosion in different ideology, but because of better math. We're doing better math, asking different questions, and it's changing the narrative, changing the dialogue, which is one reason why many governments don't want to do the math, because they don't want to change the conversation. If you think that with all those problems, technology is going to save us, and I go from conference to conference, it feels at times, answering questions about automated cars and such, all indications suggest that depending on the government's willingness to regulate automated cars, regulate, I know that's not an easy word to handle in the United States. Unless you're willing to regulate them, all indication is automated cars will add a lot more traffic congestion and actually make cities much, much worse. Unless we're willing to regulate, which means you in the United States have to get over an ideological hump in that context. So the bad news is technology very likely may make things worse in terms of how we plan and design cities. It'll probably reduce accidents and save lives, which is a good thing, but it will not and actually may go backwards in the context of how we plan and design cities and how much space cars need. I'm a big fan of this kind of tech, the simple ideas that actually make walking and biking easier, like wheeled luggage and trolleys that facilitate the idea that you can actually walk to the grocery store, taking away one more excuse for why you need maybe the second car or at least the first car or even the first car. The good news is if technology isn't going to make it easier for us, demographics may very well. The largest demographic group on planet Earth now, because the baby boomers have started to pass away, are the millennials. They think entirely differently than previous generations around automobile use, transit, walking, cycling. and whether or not they even get a driver's license. About half of them suggest they have no interest in getting a driver's license. This used to be the second largest demographic group in history, but then their parents started to pass away. So they think entirely differently about the kind of communities they want to live in, and they are way more interested and willing to be mobile if they're not getting what they want, because they don't necessarily buy into the idea of setting down roots in one city forever. Their parents also are increasingly starting to think in a different way, and I hope no one is offended. I once had a senior tell me they were very offended by this term, and I told them it's not my term, it's the Wall Street Journal's, but I admit I show it in slides because I think it's clever in a sense. They called boomers that were doing things differently broken hipsters, in the sense that they were acting like hipsters were supposed to be acting in terms of wanting to live in urban, cool, walkable neighborhoods. Why? Because they don't want to be car dependent, and two, because they want to be close to their kids and grandkids, and they don't necessarily want to live in places where their grandkids can't afford to be. So this demographic group, the other largest demographic group in history, are literally competing with their children for the real estate in the walkable, bikeable, transit-friendly communities. And they're winning because they have all the money, unless they're paying for their kids' mortgage, which happens increasingly. But the point is, the two largest demographic groups in human history are essentially fighting over finite urban space because we're not building enough of it. So what's our excuse for not building more? The demographic group in the middle, the group that's having families, the narrative is usually, well, then they want to move out of any urban place and they want to go and move to the suburbs in the white picket fence, so to speak. In Vancouver, we have 7,000 children in our downtown peninsula, 7,000 children, which is about 6,800 more than we had a couple decades ago. Downtown Vancouver is the only place in the city of Vancouver that has been growing in kids. Other neighborhoods, because of empty nesters, have actually been depopulating in kids, and the schools are under threat of closure. In Vancouver, you can't swing a stick downtown without hitting a daycare. And we just opened our second downtown elementary school, a 4-story vertical elementary school. We specifically for decades have been planning and designing for families. We ensure that there are 2 and 3 bedroom units that can fit families, homes that can fit families. We design the public realm in a way that works for kids, because we say if it works for kids, it works for everyone. And we provide, often through tools like density bonusing, the amenities and the infrastructure that facilitate families, like daycare and community facilities and play facilities, etc. And when you do that, you get numbers of kids that will shock and surprise you. We're having a really hard time keeping up with the daycare demands. But the narrative that families don't want to live in urban places is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's true because we've made it true. We design urban places to virtually repel families. We build 1-bedroom units or studios that can't fit families. There's no infrastructure like daycare or schools. And the streets are often even hostile to strollers or young children. And then it's a whole other conversation when they become teenagers. And then we say, see, the families didn't want to leave, or didn't want to come, or if they came, they left. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because we've been designing urban places very badly. This is a problem because even if you manage to attract millennials, you won't keep them as soon as they start to have families. And the millennials are getting to the age where they're moving out of their parents' basements and they're theoretically starting families. And when they do that, they want to stay in urban places, but only in urban places that can support their needs. If not, they're going to go to the suburbs by default. And they're going to pick suburbs that facilitate transit, walking, and biking, which is why we're having a separate conversation about suburbs trying to compete for millennials by becoming multimodal. So there's a competition for millennials out there right now. Urban places that are trying to very quickly retrofit themselves to be good for families, and suburbs that are retrofitting themselves to become multimodal, because those are the two choices for millennials. And the places and the regions that provide one or the other or both win in the contest to attract millennials. I usually start earlier in my talk with this slide, but I'll put it here. I'm going to talk a lot about some things that are probably different than what you do here, what you think here. And I always joke that, and it's not really a joke, that at some point in my talk, all of you will be thinking what I call the 8 most unhelpful words in the English language, which is, we could never do that in our city. I work all over the world. That message comes in all sorts of forms. I got it quite a few times today from people I was talking to. Brent, don't you understand that we have fill in the blank? And fill in the blank means that we couldn't possibly do what you're talking about here. Or, you know, admittedly, maybe you don't want to do some of the things that I'm talking about, and that's fair enough. But don't tell me you can't. This is a city that I work in, and I advised for 2 years, Medellin, Colombia. Medellin, Colombia was the murder capital of the world in the 1990s. This was the home of Pablo Escobar, guerrilla warfare. This is the site of what they call the Medellin miracle now. It's pronounced Medellin locally. So I might switch back and forth between those two. Transit, bus-only lanes, light rail. In the hills, they repurpose cable cars because one of their governors went skiing and thought, why not? In the hill communities, they repurposed escalators from shopping malls to facilitate walkable hill and urban communities with much more radical slopes than cities have that tell me they couldn't possibly do what I'm talking about because of the slopes. And with very small amounts of money, very quickly. It's remarkable how quickly Latin American cities are acting to solve problems. And they've gone from the murder capital world to the city that the Wall Street Journal a few years ago called the most innovative city in the world. They used to be afraid to walk on the street, not because of cars, but because of murder. And now they've taken back their streets, created public spaces, and yet still, when they first called me to help them, one of the many things they were wanting help with it was about pedestrianization, because they were still trying to convince citizens that it was still safe to walk. And the thing they were afraid of now were cars. And one of the things we were talking about was how we could change things in terms of shifting from a city for cars to what they call a city for life now. And they would say to me, Brent, you don't understand. We can't do what you're telling us here because of the incredibly powerful car lobby. You don't understand how powerful the car lobby is here. And I said in a public event, and it got printed in the paper, you mean to tell me the city that took on Pablo Escobar is afraid of the car companies? And that became a little bit of an interesting rallying cry in the conversation. My point is this. They transformed themselves dealing with problems that are much harder than yours, much harder than any other city in North America, and they did it. So what's our excuse? What I'm finding in cities around the world, no matter what their context, no matter what their legislative situation, their situation with the governor, their taxation system or what have you, their climate, is the cities that are doing things are the ones that have gotten past a sort of culture of excuse. And they now have a culture of knowing what they want, i.e. vision, and they have the will and skill to get it done. And they're following through. They're actually doing it, and they're doing it much faster than any city in North America is. When I talk about density, I actually created this slide when I was chief planner, and I was going from community to community trying to explain why I'm talking about density at all. Because like other places, in Vancouver, often the narrative is if we're talking about density, it must be because developers want to make more profit or something like that. And if a city planner is talking about density, well, the planner must be in the pockets of developers. These are the things that are public interest reasons that compel or should compel public interest leaders to be having the hard conversations about the D word, the third rail of municipal politics, density. These are the things that can only be achieved through density. Reduced energy use in buildings, active transport possible and even inviting, walking, biking, and transit. More green design options, many of which are only possible with minimum density levels like district energy or even geothermal. Less sprawl, pressure on agricultural land, pressure on industrial land, pressure on any kind of land that you wish to protect. More affordable housing choices, more improved public health directly tied to how we build. Vitality, diversity, even safety. The narrative used to be that density was unsafe, but study after study has shown that you're more likely to be shot in the parking lot of a suburban shopping center than in dense urban places in most contexts. So just about every way you look at success, density, if it's designed well, is compellingly powerful to the public interest. So I always say I could care less how much developer profit there is, as long as developers make enough profit that they keep building it, because the things I want to achieve in terms of cities getting better do require development. And other than that, I don't care how much profit they make. Often I find that cities talk a good game about wanting to change the way they plan cities, build cities, but when you look at the follow-through in terms of their rules, their standards, etc., and their budget, you get a completely different story. So I've increasingly been working with cities where I've been asked to even look at connecting the dots with their follow-through, including looking at their budget. And in the context of one city I found a remarkably obvious and ironic disparity, and I started to make this statement: the truth that about a city's aspirations isn't found in its vision. This particular city had an award-winning vision. It's found in its budget. And of course, the budget in this particular city, and most, probably including yours, said a very different story. When we're talking about how cities get better, try to move towards smart planning, what I've found is that cities are usually in one of these stages, almost on an issue-by-issue basis. You start, because we've been doing this for a long time since the 1960s, you start by doing the wrong thing. We've been doing the wrong thing in city planning since the 1960s in many cases. Then after Herculean effort, we managed to get to the point where we're doing the wrong thing better. And a good example might be widening your highway but putting a bike lane next to it, or building another suburban shopping mall but putting a better landscape plan in the parking lot. There's all sorts of examples that I get shown by my clients all the time. And I want to be clear, if you're going to do the wrong thing, you might as well do it better. I'm a pragmatist in that sense. But don't mistake that for being right. Don't mistake that for doing the right thing, and make sure your conversation is making the distinction. And then I used to just have three. I added based on work in a couple of cities, Brisbane, Australia, and Denver, Colorado, this third phase of trying to have your cake and eat it too. They would fund a light rail system, but in order to get the bond measure passed, they would tie it to funding to widen the highway that's right beside it, and would wonder why transit ridership wasn't improving. You can't have your cake and eat it too. The way you improve things in the context of what I'm talking about is just as much about stopping the wrong things as it is about starting the right things. You have to make the hard choices. And then ultimately, in some contexts, you might be doing the right thing. And then you can start to ask of whether you're doing it well or not, but at least you're doing the right thing. So you can almost ask yourself on a case-by-case basis, on an issue-by-issue basis, where are you in Portsmouth or wherever you're from on this particular system. So this is the point I just made. Progress doesn't just depend on starting the right things, it depends on stopping the wrong things, and even going back and retroactively fixing the mistakes. I make that point because actually, politically often, stopping the wrong things is a lot harder than starting to do the right things. And think about that for a minute. When you start to do the right things, you get credit. You get a ribbon cutting for opening a new bike lane or a transit line. But saying no to that additional request for another suburban shopping center or more lanes on a road that's already too wide, there are going to be people mad at you for stopping doing the wrong things. They won't give you credit for it. There'll just be some people mad at you. Although the smart people should give politicians credit for stopping doing the wrong things. But it's often harder politically to stop doing the wrong things. But if you're serious about progress, critically important. So in my work with cities, I ask the hard questions of the politicians, tell them what they need to do, and tell them if they're not willing to do that, then they're not really serious about improving. Because if you're not willing to stop doing the wrong things, you're not ready to improve. I do show Vancouver. And by the way, I showed you all those historic contexts of my background, not because I was bragging, but because I wanted to take away your ability to roll your eyes at me and say, that guy's just from Vancouver. So can we agree you're not going to do that? I don't know if that was a yes. There was probably some people rolling their eyes. But I am going to show Vancouver. I'm going to show tall buildings in some cases. Don't get distracted by the height of the building or the material. Listen to the urban principles and figure out how it applies to your city and your context. Because I don't sell building programs and try to apply them in other cities. I talk about principles that can be applied differently in different places. But let's be clear. Vancouver does tall buildings, high density, a lot of the things you're afraid of, and is considered one of the most livable cities in the world, one of the most healthy cities in the world, named by a branding company as one of the most reputable city brands, most visitable city in the world by Condé Nast, top green city, innovation city, walking city, transit city, biking city, coffee city, which is kind of crazy. My Colombian clients don't understand that. Top beach city. The point is, you can get ranked for just about anything. Everything I talk about here is in the context of an economically successful city, a socially successful city, if you can afford it. Affordability is a huge challenge, which is often associated to a lot of people wanting to take part in this, which is a good problem to have in some cases, although not an easy problem to deal with. The point is, there's a lot of ideology about things like height and density that often stand in the way of actual success. But the conversation has to be not about how dense and how tall only. It has to be about quality. I created this slide for the mayor of Sydney, Australia, because she was struggling with a conversation about how to convert the conversation about good design, quality being about beautification, aesthetics, superficial issues. So I talked about all the actual value creation things from an economic perspective, from a bottom line business case perspective, that great design creates. And I do this because I reject the notion from some cities that try to pit good planning and design against being open for business. Like if you have a high standard for the quality of things that are being built, you're going to scare away tax revenue. It's a false choice. Great design creates value initially and lasting value. I'm not going to read these all out, just read them. But the basis for just about any way you measure economic success at the city level, the developer level, the taxation level, augmented by great design. Not superficial design, but fundamental great design. A simpler way of putting it, beauty outperforms ugly in just about every way you can measure, and it's remarkable how expensive ugly can be. So, yes, I showed you the tall towers in the downtown. That's the downtown in the background, but this is the foreground of Vancouver. It's not that different from you in terms of scale and density. And yet all of these communities are going through densification processes. Not to build towers necessarily, but having a conversation about what density means in different contexts, a contextual density. And then there's the region. And in the region, the problem is sprawl. The problem is low density, single detached units predominantly in a car-dependent pattern. And let's be clear, we can do our inner cities almost perfectly. I didn't just tour your inner city, your downtown. I went out to the burbs and looked at what you're building out on the highway, out on the arterial roads. And it's as bad as any other place I see anywhere. There's nothing special about Portsmouth once you get out of the city center, it seems to me, your historic core. You're doing it as badly as every other place. Sorry. But, oh, I did. I apologized. That was so Canadian of me. I don't normally do that. The success or failure of our city regions, and you are part of a larger geographic region, economic region certainly, and ultimately our survival in the context of public health and death and climate change depends on how well we do our suburbs, because that's still where most people live, and that's still where most people are going. And you've got some ideological baggage that you've applied to your city center that you seem to insist on applying for the rest of your city, and that's holding you back from some possibilities that might make your suburbs a lot better. That's my initial observation after today. Some urbanists use sprawl and suburbia interchangeably. I don't. Not all suburbia is sprawl. It doesn't have to be sprawl, but too much suburbia is sprawl. And your stuff on the edge is sprawl, because it's car dependent. The key problem of sprawl, the key definition of sprawl in my case, because I try to keep things simple, is sprawl is auto dependent. There's no credible alternatives. And I say credible in the sense that any rational person who has choices would actually use some of the other alternatives like walking, biking, or transit. So this is sprawl. This is our suburbs in Metro Vancouver, in the cities that are surrounding Vancouver. This is your typical 1960s suburban shopping mall with the sea of parking around it. You've got some of these out on your edge I saw and visited. But that's a transit station, our SkyTrain technology built next to it. And this is what's just about finished in terms of construction. Everything in the foreground, the two towers, the transit-oriented public space oriented towards the SkyTrain station, everything except the two towers that are ghosted in the back, is actually being built on the parking lot of the mall. Hasn't even had to touch the mall yet. And that's everything you can build in terms of transit orientation and a complete community, so you can walk and bike to things and not necessarily even need to take public transit. So we don't even call it transit-oriented development. It's just good urbanism. But it really shows how much you can do just in the parking lot. Phase 2 is going to be affecting the mall, those other towers. Again, don't be distracted by the height of the building. Look at the opportunity in terms of intensification. Don't be so focused on how tall the buildings are. In the transit corridors, we're doing mid-rise, but doing it consistently along our transit corridors, in this case, Canada Line, which is the subway line that we opened in time for hosting the 2010 Winter Olympics. It connects the airport to our downtown and goes through all of our urban neighborhoods. So I went out and looked at your suburbs and went to one of your shopping malls. Somebody would have to remind me what the name of the shopping mall is, but I was looking for this. I was looking for some evidence of evolution beyond the initial idea of a car-dependent shopping mall. And I found one thing. I found housing. But I had interesting conversations about why not taller. There's no heritage context here. There's no inherent context-driven sensitivity. Why apply the same perspective on scale that you do in your historic center everywhere, except you're just sort of transplanting your ideological idea from the downtown to every place else. I looked to see if there was anything around the shopping mall that would be negatively impacted if a taller building were there, and this is what's beside it. So there's nobody that would even complain. Oh, well, okay, someone might complain. It doesn't make them right. When we're talking about density in Vancouver while I was there, we connected the dots to all these public interest things. I led a process called eco-density. How am I doing for time? I'm probably going to have to start to pass through some slides. I started our eco-density initiative, which was a conversation, a 2-year conversation about how we use density strategically to lower our ecological footprint by showing the carbon footprint in Vancouver. The downtown, 1.5 tons of GHG emissions per person to 3 in the inner city, the rest of the city 6, the rest of the region about 9 to a 12. Climate scientists will tell you for climate stabilization, we can't be generating more than about 1.8 tons per person. So the theory is that only the people living in that high density downtown I show you are not contributing to climate change. And that's only if they don't eat red meat or fly like I do to places. The point is, we have to make the best use of our urban space if we are serious about issues like climate change. It's not just what height you feel comfortable with. Are your children going to inherit a good planet? That's the nature of the conversation we're having. And are your ideological feelings about 5 versus 6 stories more important than the future of your children and grandchildren? That's the truth. That's the facts. That's science. That's not fake news. I'm going to skip past it. This was the conversation that we had for 2 years, an incredibly tough conversation. If you think it's easy to talk about density in Vancouver, trust me, it ain't. The activists in Vancouver, the anti-density activists, are just as strong or maybe stronger than here. One of the main activists in Vancouver is the son of Jane Jacobs. If you haven't had a debate about Jane Jacobs until you've had it with her son, and I've done that. So, incredible conversation, and ultimately a unanimous approval by a split council, because we had evidence, storytelling, facts, human stories, all related to how density, if it's done well, density by design, can change the city. I'm going to skip past some of this. Oh boy, I really have a lot of slides. Where's my person? How much time do I have left? 10 minutes, okay, thanks. I'm going to go through the 3 elements of density done well reasonably quickly, and then because I do want to stop and have some good conversation. The first is Land use and mobility aligned, one conversation, not separated in City Hall, not separated in your conversations in the community. It starts with making sure you understand that you can never build your way out of congestion by widening roads. I hope everyone understands that now, but there's still a lot of misinformation about that. But I'm glad to see that mainstream media, because of a lot of us, I think, in social media pushing this issue, has recognized that building bigger roads actually makes traffic worse. This is where Vancouver would have built our freeway, lobotomizing our waterfront and downtown, separating it from the downtown, devastating Stanley Park, which was recently named one of the best, if not the best urban park in the world. Rejected not by smart urban planners, because the planners weren't smart in that era, rejected by ordinary citizens, mothers and grandmothers who were protecting stable, low-income communities from being devastated. But now we realize, and actually we did realize back then, if anyone was listening to people like the great Lewis Mumford, adding highway lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. We've known that since 1955. Traffic engineers since 1955 have been trying to pretend we don't know it, but we do. In Vancouver, what we say is the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. In other words, if you get your land use right, your density right, your land use mix, the actual mode shift to walking, biking, and transit is not that hard if you're willing to spend on infrastructure. But if you get the land use wrong, you can blow your brains out trying to spend money on infrastructure, and you won't get people out of their cars. So, yes, many cities are actually trying to retrofit their mistakes. My clients in Medellin are burying their freeway with an urban park over top. My clients in Oslo, Norway, before I started working with them, buried their freeway that was separating the fjord from the downtown. And the cool thing is, they built a whole neighborhood on top of where the freeway was. Office space, residential, community facilities, a ton of actual city building, and a multimodal boulevard with bus-only lanes, light rail, bike lanes, widened sidewalks. And the cool thing is, that multimodal boulevard moves more people every day than the freeway used to. Not more cars, more people. Because as soon as you start to realize that the job of mobility is to move people, not cars, you can move a lot more people with a lot less space and a lot less public money if you rethink your car space. I'm going to skip that. Oh, you want to? I got to show this to you. It's my highest tech graphic in my presentation. I've had it for 15 years. In Vancouver, we had what we call the years of the warlords, the transportation engineers and the city planners fighting it out for supremacy at City Hall. And land use and transportation never talked to each other. See, there's my graphic. Pretty impressive, right? But the transportation plan in 1997 changed that, where they, I wasn't there yet, of course, coined the term plangineer to suggest a common definition of success around great city making. Now it's a hashtag everywhere, but it was Vancouver that coined it in the 1990s. And it was the idea that land use and mobility would be looked at together. And that transportation plan did several things, but one of the most important things it did was reject this notion of balancing ways of getting around. I call balance code for the status quo, only slightly better. What balance means is you prioritize walking first, then biking, then public transit, then goods movement, and then the car. Vancouver very rarely bans the car, but we prioritize it last. And another way I put it now is, if you design a city for cars, it fails for everyone, including drivers. If you design a multimodal city, it works better for everyone, including drivers. I say it that way because we have to get past this lazy narrative of the so-called war on the car, which is a political bullshit line that media likes because it gets good clicks, but it's not true. Anybody who understands cities knows that this is true. If you try to design for cars, nobody moves, because it is ultimately about space. So you design walkable cities where both the horizontal and the vertical are designed to reward the walker at eye level at the speed of a pedestrian for making the sustainable and healthy choice. New York breaks their analysis down at incredibly fine detail, but Vancouver just keeps it simple. No blank walls. You have to have something visually interesting and transparent and engaging along your street edge. It isn't enough to design something nice horizontally. You have to design the vertical street edge. I've seen indications of problems in terms of your blank walls. You also have an awful lot of very tight walkable spaces in the horizontal sense. And then you have to have enough space for all of those people who don't necessarily want to move. In our new transportation plan, I co-led it with our transportation director, and the goal was to move beyond just movement and recognize that streets are for people. So I started using the term sticky streets to talk about streets that actually encourage you to slow down and stop. Is there space for patios? Is there space for seating? For stopping and talking with a neighbor and people with strollers can still get by you? Or is everything very tight? The second priority is cycling. I won't say much about bike infrastructure except to say if you're serious about mode shift towards cycling, you need separated bike lanes. Not painted lines, separated bike lanes on any street or road that is fast with high volumes. Period. If you don't have that, you're not serious. This is one of our first separated bike lanes in the downtown. We did it slowly, one at a time. I called that pulling the Band-Aid off slowly. Don't do it one at a time. Do what Calgary did, my former city. I planned for Calgary for 6 years before Vancouver. And they did a pilot of the downtown with essentially a minimum grid, a complete network, and showed that it could work if you actually connect many origins and destinations. The third priority is transit. All I'll say in that context is, we get distracted by cool technology like SkyTrain or light rail. The hero of Vancouver transit, and Vancouver is a remarkable success story in terms of transit. The hero is frequent buses. Buses with high frequency. They may not be sexy, but they're cheap, flexible, and they work. They are the backbone and heroes of a good, successful transit system. I'm going to skip past some of that. Oh, and simplify your routes. Focus on ridership, simplify your routes, and you get your ridership up. So the car is last, but there's a lot of attention to be paid in terms of the car, and particularly in terms of car share. We did a study. Vancouver is the most successful car share city in North America in terms of number of cars, usership, etc. And every car share space replaces 20 privately owned vehicles moving around taking up space in roads and parking and all of that public cost associated with it. So when you recognize that mobility in cities, in urban places, is about space, it's not necessarily about what comes out of the tailpipe. Electric cars won't solve this problem. It's about how you move people around with less space, less infrastructure, and less public cost. And how we've been prioritizing the space to move the vehicle instead of moving the people. And everybody else is disadvantaged. You've seen these kind of photos? Yes? No? Oh, that's Munster. I think it's the first one that I ever found. I've got about 150 of them now. Mayors send them to me because they know I'll tweet them. And every city wants to do it now. It makes the point about how much space. And it's not even an accurate point because, of course, that's how much space a car takes when it's not moving. But cars take way more space, separation distance, when they're actually moving. My favorite is Santiago, where I just worked last year, because they made the extra point. They made the same point, but they made the extra point that when a bus is stuck in that traffic, look at all the people stuck on the bus in all that traffic because of the space taken up by everybody else. How fair is that? How equitable is that? And there's cool ways to even illustrate the point that even how much space taken up for parking is dramatic when you think about cities. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to triage. I'm ad-libbing too much. I do want to talk, you're lucky, I'll skip past some of the slides that would probably have scared you most anyway. Look at those tall buildings. But this is our waterfront in Vancouver. The actual architecture I find monotonous and boring, but what you focus on is that the towers are slim and they're separated and they're stepped back from the streets. This is the human scale at grade that establishes a walkable street because of the podium that is human scaled, and then the towers are separated and stepped back. My predecessor, Larry Beasley, always said they float out of the perception of the walker. So you get a human-scaled street with all of those advantages, and then the towers are for body heat because people ride down the elevator, which I consider a form of public transit, and they interact with their street and their community. They walk their kids to school, they walk to groceries, etc. But if you build lousy tall buildings, this is Montparnasse Tower in Paris, you can have decades of never building tall towers again because they're so horrible. People will never accept them again. So if you ever do want to build a tall tower, you better do it really well, as Paris illustrated. But then finally, they built La Défense, which is outside the historic urban pattern, and that was a place where they could build height. A question I think you should be asking in the context of some of your other urban areas. Why not build something of a different scale outside your historical pattern? If you want to hear more or read more about my perspectives on tall towers, which I know are controversial, but very dogmatic, just Google that article and you can find more. Let's see. I showed you those. The third element is amenities. As you're densifying, you should actually be providing and actually leveraging density to pay for the things that make density livable and even lovable. This is our seawall, our waterfront. It saddened me to see how few public spaces you actually have on your water edge. So much of your water edge has been, probably always was privatized because of your riparian rights, but very sad. Our seawall, our first principle of waterfront development is we never, ever, ever give up. And if we did give up in the past, we buy back the public edge for civic life. And then we use density to pay for, as a density bonusing strategy, the kind of amenities that, frankly, we'd never be able to afford as a municipality. So parks, playgrounds, particularly emphasizing kids, but other things like heritage preservation and restoration, we use density to achieve that. Community facilities, cultural facilities, daycare, etc. We do more density, but we leverage more from density than any other city in the world. And I know that because I did a study of every main system in the world for the city of Sydney, Australia. But it's about density at every scale. No scale dogma, but a high expectation for quality of design and the value creation that ensues from that at every single scale. Just because you made a building short doesn't make it good. You can have short, bad buildings, and you can have tall, good buildings. The variable is the design. But a lot of cities spend all of their attention focused on how many stories a building has. We do a lot of mid-rise buildings in Vancouver. We don't get nearly enough attention for the quality of the actual mid-rise buildings that we do. Our Olympic Village, where we hosted the athletes from around the world, it was considered the greenest community in North America. Still is. It actually has still the highest LEED ND points ever granted for the 2010 Winter Games. Great public spaces, there's contemporary architecture. I know that can be controversial. But we also have heritage, faux heritage architecture. In the context of the development as well. But the important thing is the design, the passive design reduced the energy load of the buildings by 30% right off the bat, from passive solar shading, externalization of walkways and stairwells so it doesn't need artificial lighting, rainwater collection, it's Vancouver, it rains a lot, but even solar, it doesn't rain all the time, and district energy system, the largest in North America, capturing the waste heat from the sewer system and using it to heat the space and the potable water. And that made it the lowest carbon footprint, greenest community still in North America. But it's about high quality design at every scale and not having this kind of scale dogma. I called it gentle density in the context of the eco-density exercise. And I use terms like gentle density, hidden density, which is laneway housing in the back off the lane, and invisible density, which is what we call secondary suites. You call them accessory dwelling units. They are no-brainers in terms of housing policy, and yet still politically controversial, I know. My friend in California, Daniel Perolik, calls it the missing middle, all those housing types in between the detached house and the mid-rise. We need to have more conversation about those kinds of housing units, which can actually stabilize low-density neighborhoods by allowing empty nesters to downsize in their community and returning kids back into the neighborhood so your school isn't under threat of closure anymore. These kind of housing forms actually stabilize neighborhoods, but if you listen to the narrative, it's always about the fear that they will destabilize them. So gentle, hidden, and invisible density. We have to think of terms and ways to have conversations about density that have nothing to do with even mid-rise, let alone tall towers. And yes, when I led the laneway housing initiative, a lot of people said, why are you focused on such a small idea? We have actually that's an out-of-date slide. We have over 3,500 approved laneway housing forms, and we have a net zero laneway house. One of the most successful, the most successful secondary suite or ADU program in North America. But if you think density is easy to talk about, this is a typical headline in Vancouver. And this is a poster that a community group did when we, along an arterial, proposed to go from 40 stories to 50 stories. And in most cities, I would say that, and it gets a laugh. Here, I think this happens here frequently, that you have incredible controversies over the increase of just an additional story, which is remarkable to me, I have to say. But I usually make the point just to show how good the graphic skills are of the community groups in Vancouver. One of my heroes, Jonathan Barnett, says it's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense. I disagree with my hero. It's both. But we need to have the conversation about quality, not just the conversation about how tall. And quality isn't just about whether it does a good job of mimicking heritage. Quality is about the fundamentals of good urban design. We need to move the conversation from NIMBY, not in my backyard, to QUIMBY, quality in my backyard. Having a conversation and ensuring that your municipality has the tools, the culture, the vision, will, and skill, the follow-through to actually ensure that if density is contemplated and height is contemplated, you will be able to follow through and actually deliver that quality. That's one of the things I spend a lot of time working with my city clients on. I'll end, and I'm almost done, with a flurry of quick slides to show a sort of, while we're doing all this permanent city building, there's a lot of quick, simple things that I hope you're doing. You Americans call it tactical urbanism. Other parts of the world call it different things. But the point is there's a lot of really simple ideas out there to strengthen our cities. It's remarkable how hard we can make those simple things. My clients in Auckland took a parking lot on the waterfront and literally overnight with planters and paint turned it into a walkable boulevard, and it was immediately successful. Food trucks and food carts are a great placemaker, not to provide food, but to provide place. But we tend to have them as a conversation about competition with restaurants or things like that. They are good gap fillers when you've got surface parking lots and other dead spaces in your urban walkable places. Containers are great for this too. I have heard cities say, oh, we're a high quality, high value city. We would never have containers. That's for less affluent places. This is Helsinki, Oslo, New York City, Halifax in Canada. These are all sorts of different cities of all sorts of different socioeconomic status. And by the way, that's Christchurch, where 80% of the building stock was knocked down after the Christchurch earthquake. And they are the best in the world at filling gaps in their urban pattern. But I often say that you shouldn't have to have an earthquake to realize that you have gaps and dead spaces in your urban patterns. Your parking spaces, I hope you've got a parklet program, do you? Taking a look at your parking spaces, you've got plenty of parking spaces. I'm sure you think you have a parking problem in your downtown, because almost every city does. Your parking problem is you've got too much parking. And you can take some of that parking. Wow, I went really late into my presentation before getting any applause. You can turn it into all sorts of things. Streeteries, parklets for green spaces, all sorts of different things by just rethinking. You should be thinking about this because your actual sidewalks are so tight. You don't have room to do these, but you do have room to do them if you rethink those parking spaces. And in the meantime, I collect little things in cities that are just fun and whimsical, and I use it under the hashtag City of Smiles, so if you're on Twitter, you can look for that. In the meantime, let's just lighten up and get out of our own way and have a little bit of fun in our cities. But in the meantime, be prepared to get real about the vision, will, and skill you need to really change if you really want to change. Thank you very much. Now, where's my fellow? How much time do I actually have for Q&A now that I went long? Oh, great. Okay, I can't see particularly well. Do you want to?
I'm looking for hands for people that have questions.
That's a good idea. Let's do that. And those lights off, if we can. Or maybe.
Hi.
Oh, that's better.
It's on.
And by the way, I hope if you've been live tweeting, you've been using my Twitter accounts, but that's how you reach me on Twitter. If you're not already following me. You should follow me because you can see what I've been saying about Portsmouth all day.
Brad, I would just wanted to say that I think that was, what did we decide? Gate something? Bay Gate. No.
Southgate.
Southgate, the mall.
Oh, Southgate.
And you mentioned the fact that if you don't put enough housing there, something's going to happen. If you could explain that whole
Right, there was,
piece.
well, I'm not going to speak out of school relative to conversations I've had today, but there's concern about too much density out in the suburbs. And I get that. But what I've found is that we sort of, because of our fear of the implications of density, create what I call the sweet spot of failure. We put just enough density out there because we're worried about too much. And the car problems it will cause, localized car traffic problems that it will cause. We put enough to cause those car problems, but not enough to break past those car problems and actually make something like transit workable, or have a complete community enough that people will actually be able to live and work in proximity to each other. But because we're so worried about density, we lower it just enough to fail and actually realize all the things we're afraid of and not achieve any of the things we actually want to achieve. So my perception is you've started to put a little density in next to your mall. You don't do that kind of thing all the way along the strip. You pick certain centers and nodes, and you connect those to your center city by transit because they have enough critical mass to be complete in the context of interrelationships and enough to warrant a connection through transit to your city center. But you can ideologically get worried about whether that will weaken your downtown and thus be really afraid of creating these competing centers. They're not competing centers. They make your city better. And I say that, by the way, again, having spent most of my career as a downtown planner fighting to protect downtowns. I know how to protect downtowns. And downtowns are not weakened by the right kind of planned space out there and can actually strengthen and keep more money and dollar flow in your community, but not if you do it badly. And I think there's a fear here, and can be a fear here, that you may not have the political positioning, the tools, etc., to make sure it's good. And if you don't, and if it's not good, we better not do it at all. I get that. I get that instinct. But I've found that cities with more barriers than you actually can transform in order to make it good if you actually want to. But right now, you're talking yourself out of the idea right off the bat.
Any response to that, or further questions?
Hi, thanks very much. In our last election here, this subject was a big one, and a couple of the strongest arguments for pro-density were not raised in your discussion, these made by our candidates.
Which are?
One is that by increasing density in Portsmouth, we will lower real estate prices by creating more supply. I'm a little skeptical of this idea. And secondly, that we can increase density, which means a population increase and not increased cost to the city, or at least not in a so it would end in lower taxes. So I wondered if you could address those two issues, which are very prominent in our public discussion.
I did address both of them. I just evidently didn't address them well enough. I did mention affordability in the context of the reasons why we do density. I'm careful because I like to be right, and I don't use a compelling argument that might be effective but is also wrong. I believe in being right. The thing about density and supply and affordability, depending on the nature of your actual demand, if your demand is localized versus other places, additional density won't necessarily lower prices. It won't necessarily. But what I say is additional density of the right type is a precondition for lower prices. In other words, if you don't do density, there's no chance your prices will go down unless you have something else cataclysmic happen, like your major military employment closes. Then your prices will go down because people will leave and have to sell their places. So, but in the absence of something like that, additional supply won't necessarily lower prices, but it will mitigate price increases. And I think your prices are going up faster because of a lack of supply. I say it that way because you can imagine how many times in my career I've had somebody say, well, we've been increasing density in Vancouver and the prices keep going up? And the answer, of course, is yes, the prices keep going up because we're still not getting close to providing enough supply to meet demand. And part of the demand in Vancouver is international demand, which is an extra challenge that requires extra and different tools. But in the context of even just localized demand, if you provide more supply, but the demand is still higher, your prices will still go up. That's economics 101. But even if you provide enough or more supply, or even if prices are still going up, I guarantee that they're not going up as much as they otherwise would, because it is an absolute truth that supply and demand works. So if your prices are still going, or if your prices are still going up relative to demand, it means the demand is still higher than the supply. That's the simple answer, but the affordability question has to be a broader question than conversation than that. What's the nature of your supply? Is it high-end price point, low-end price point? Is it affordable housing? Is it tools and methods like co-op? Where is the supply relative to something like transit or walkable context, so you can not have to own the second car or maybe even the first? Do you have car share? And thus, can you reduce your household income not just by housing price, but by transportation price? What are your energy costs? Do you have jobs close by that are high paying, so you're addressing the salary side of affordability? That needs to be the conversation. It's an affordable living conversation instead of just an affordable housing conversation. So that's my broad point about density as it relates to affordability. What was your second point again, just quickly?
The second point is follows that.
Just one line, quick.
It's about taxes. It's about, if we build more, are we going to stabilize our tax situation?
Oh. Well, I've learned today that you have a different taxation system than many places. Your taxation is almost entirely property, or is property tax based. So not only would I say that it will contribute to your tax base, but the nature of the density will determine the contribution to the tax base. You should want high quality density because that will contribute to your tax base more. In other words, don't just say we're open for business. Fight for quality of density because it will be the better value proposition for your tax base. But I just gave you a bunch of reasons for why density is important to the public interest that don't have to do with tax base. I don't like to go out to communities and say we need to do density because of our tax base. It seems like a very superficial argument. It's true, but that necessarily shouldn't be the reason why you do density. It's like, oh, I have to take density because of my tax base. There are all sorts of compelling public interest reasons why we need density to address a lot of our challenges. Plus, if we design it well, our quality of life can go up. So it shouldn't just be about taking your medicine, your financial medicine, if you will.
Taxes here are affordability because our underlying property taxes are going up a lot.
I get it. Taxes are an affordability issue everywhere. And you don't have income taxes, for example. So you're a more affordable city if you're a renter, for example, because of the property tax base, assuming it doesn't add to the rent rates. Well, that's probably supply and demand. You probably don't have enough rental units. I've been impressed by how much actual employment you have here. I really didn't know much about your economic base. And so I'm not surprised you have a problem because your approaches and perspectives around density and growth relative to your actual employment situation, what you have is more people than you have housing. And so people, because of affordability or just a lack of choice at all, have to drive further away. And now they're contributing to climate change and reducing their health and their social life relative to their family, etc. That's because you're not addressing issues properly in the context of your municipal government.
Okay, we've got one question here, and then one there, and one here.
How do you make the transition for...
Where are you?
Right over here.
Oh, there, okay.
Make the transition public transportation. If you do a high density in an area and tie in public transportation, because we have very limited public transportation here, and where do those costs, who's going to pay that? Because if you provide public transportation for high density, you think, well, the developer or whoever put that in there ought to pay for that. or something. What's your suggestions in terms of handling that?
Well, if you provide enough critical mass in the, I don't know where your public, I would have to sit down for a day with your staff and figure out where your origins and destinations are right now, what your existing ridership is now, whether you focus on ridership or coverage, which has a really big effect on your frequency, et cetera. Whether you're underfunding transit, which I have no doubt you are, because every city in North America pretty much is. But the solutions and who pays for it depends on a number of things. If you have enough critical mass that you're planning in an area, it can easily support transit without transit, quote unquote, paying for itself, which is kind of a big lie. Transit doesn't have to pay for itself in terms of the fare box, because transit makes the land use work, and land use generates your tax base here, right? So some cities in the context of transit technology like light rail actually make developers pay for it. But then developers rarely want to build the thing that makes the most sense for a municipality. I would front end the transit as an investment in your future by starting to run it to a place like a center where you want to build more density, because you can't get the density on the promise of transit, because the market doesn't believe you. And the value won't be created. But if you front end the transit service and let it run at a deficit for a while, and that becomes the catalyst for the land use, then you use the tax base to pay for it eventually. And America has tools like tax increment financing, where you could use that and have the actual development as the payback for the front ending of the transit. So there's tools to do it. You need the critical mass of land use. Everything starts with land use. And yeah, cities often say, well, let the developer pay for it. The land use is paying for it. And maybe you do get the developer to pay for it. Maybe it's a density bonusing as part of it. But don't do it in the way that some cities negotiate it, where it ends up being the transit the developer wants, not the transit that you need.
Oh, okay. I'm asking about Vancouver and how do you deal with workforce housing, making it affordable? We have the same issue here. We don't have public transport like you do, and people have to travel out. But how do you address that in Vancouver? Because it's so
Well, having
expensive.
workforce relative to work places is really important. Where's the workforce and where's the housing? Around the places where your jobs are right now, your existing large employers, do you have housing right near them? Right? Well, do I have to make a point about that? So that's part of it. Workforce, in terms of the nature, you need to look at the nature of your workforce and make sure you're building, you're forcing the market to build the kind of housing that works with that. And I know that's really strange to say, because in America, government doesn't like to force the marketplace. But the truth is, you intervene in the marketplace way more than other countries like Canada do. You know, the whole narrative that Canada is socialist and you guys are free market. America subsidizes business and development and sprawl way more than Canada does. You're socialist. We're a free market, because we actually make developers pay for things that you guys are subsidizing. It's remarkable. It really is. It's fake news that we subsidize more than you. So I think you have to have a vision for what you want. You have to have actually studied it. Maybe your planning department has done all this. But the relationship of where the two things are, how they're connected. But right now, I think you're putting the jobs are where they are. The housing is where it's most politically palatable and not necessarily where they're most smartly located. And you get that disconnect, and everybody has to drive everywhere. And you have to build these massive seas of parking to address it.
I was going to ask.
Is that? Am I being unfair? Is that accurate or not? Okay.
So we have a question. Oh, I was going to ask about the whole. Somebody was saying, well, why should we have more density? And do you want to talk a little bit about the whole question of value per acre, and particularly for a state that bases its taxation on property values? There's a huge advantage to having more valuable things more close together. rather than spreading them out across the countryside. And do you have any thoughts about how to have that conversation?
Other than the presentation I just gave? More? More?
about that.
More.
But particularly in terms of that full property tax piece.
Well, you have a greater built-in incentive than most cities to want to do density because your taxation system is leading to it, which I actually consider good. You know, if you've got a taxation system that is encouraging something good, then you've got a smart taxation system. I say that because I work in places where the taxation system is incenting the wrong thing. I worked in Tulsa a few years ago. It's all sales tax based. They virtually have no property taxes, and they're way overbuilding retailing, hoping to God people will spend money in their municipality. And you get stupid land use patterns from a commercial planning perspective. So you're better off. I don't know if you have said, oh, the darn property tax system. It's an incentive for smart growth. The problem is you might feel so in need of that tax base, you might say, bring it on, anything goes, I desperately need that tax base quickly, and because I'm open for business, and you don't ensure that it's really high quality outcomes. And there's two downsides to that. One is you actually are leaving money on the table relative to the actual value and thus tax base you can generate, because the better it is, the more tax base you'll get. And really, the cities that are failing are the ones that are desperate for anything. Are you a failing city? So you should have the confidence to insist on better. The other thing is you get the political blowback. If you build crappy stuff, you get the political blowback, and it's an accurate political blowback. I often say, if you're someone, cities often say to me, what do we do with the NIMBYs, Brent? And I don't like the term NIMBYs generally. I understand its context, but NIMBYs are people, and I like people. But people are afraid of things. The problem, I often say, isn't that NIMBYs are afraid of things. The problem is that when NIMBYs who are afraid of things show up at city council, council does what they say. And that's council's fault. Because you can learn from NIMBYs and make a more educated decision, but if you just say no to something good because the NIMBYs told you so, but you know better as a municipal leader, then I don't blame the NIMBYs. I blame the political leaders who knew better. But what I often say is, if you don't like NIMBYs, don't let them be right. And they're right when you approve crappy things. So you need to have a conversation about quality. And I was told today in several different ways by several different people, Brent, we do have a conversation about quality here, but my sense is the conversation about quality is almost entirely focused on whether the architecture is fake heritage versus contemporary and how many floors the building has. And if it looks heritage and is less than a certain number of floors, quality, check. That's not a good enough conversation about quality. Do you think that's unfair?
This might involve more beer.
Well, there's a bar right here.
Yeah, we should all buy another round. Ideally, I have three questions, but the first one is, in New Hampshire, like many other places, New Hampshire chased Amazon. And the best the state of New Hampshire could come up with was a new urban project that had not been designed for Amazon, that's out in the middle of, basically out in the middle of nowhere, with no public transit, and none of the amenities that Amazon wanted. That's all the state of New Hampshire could come up with. So that's one comment.
You wasted your time.
They did. So the next
You
one...
had no chance of getting Amazon because you don't have, I could have told you, just based on what I saw today, that you had no chance of getting Amazon. You don't have transit, you don't have density, you don't have walkability, you don't have things that the millennials want, you don't even have millennial housing. And you can't build it fast enough to accommodate Amazon.
Right.
What I find is the cities all over North America are going, oh my God, we want to get Amazon. Let's build bike lanes really quickly. Or transit, and then they don't get Amazon, because they don't have those things already, and then they go, well, we don't need bike lanes anymore. Do you see the problem with that thinking? The next time another Amazon comes along, you still don't have bike lanes, and you still don't have transit. You have to build it because it's right for the city first. The cities that are competing
Thank
for
you.
Amazon are good cities because they
They're
want to
already
be good
there.
cities.
Yeah,
But now, of course, they're in the race for the bottom around incentives, and don't get me started about that.
right. So the next thing is, would you say again, for the purpose of the headline in the newspaper tomorrow,
Is there media here?
we need housing at Pease, our major employer.
I don't know what Pease is.
That's basically the Commerce Park on the other side of the highway. It's the major employer in the city. There is no housing there.
You need to do a better job orienting your housing relative to your employment. I'm not going to make a specific statement about a specific
That's
employer
good.
I don't
That's good
understand.
enough. That's
But that
good
is a basic truth of good city building.
Thank you.
And the fact that you haven't done it is one of the reasons why you're auto-dependent, and it's one of the reasons why you don't currently have good public transit. You know, the fact you don't have a public transit is a result of your decisions. It's not a cosmic truth. You know, you don't lack public transit because public transit never ever would have come here. You lack public transit because of the decisions you made, which make public transit infeasible here. If you had made different choices or make different choices in the future, you can have public transit. But there's a perspective amongst many cities that because they don't have public transit, that because of the decisions they made, that they're not a city that can ever have public transit. You see what I mean?
I just wanted to ask any questions from Portsmouth High School Ecology Club. We have representatives here tonight. No pressure. Any other questions from anybody in the audience or comments, feedback?
So somebody asked the question kind of earlier about workforce housing, and I think you kind of lost on you our definition of workforce housing. It's
Maybe it's something different than I'm thinking?
Yeah, it's affordable housing, like for teachers, you know, civil servants, you know, people who work in hospitality, sort of the middle range, lower range of income.
You
know,
mean people.
Yeah, people.
Workforce housing is such a weird term. It's like a company town idea.
Right.
Where the people slog their way to work. You're describing people,
Right.
And mostly middle class people or middle to lower class.
So
or,
how in
economic
Vancouver
status.
were you able to incent affordable housing in your downtown area so that your teachers, your firefighters, your police officers, they're all living in the community that they work?
You know, if I woke up with amnesia and didn't know where I was, I'd know by that question that I was in the United States. Because you automatically went to the word incent. In the rest of the world, we regulate. If we want a certain kind of housing, the vision and the policy and the zoning says you have to do that. Now, I admit, you know, in Canada, we don't have property rights in our constitution, so I get it. It's different here. We have peace, order, and good government. That's what our Constitution actually says. Yours says live free or die and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's different. But even with property rights in your Constitution, I think you, again, talk yourself out of the ability or interest in tools like regulation. Because I know other American cities that are doing it under the same Constitution you have. So clearly it's legally possible, although it varies by state. I get that. But I think in some cases you regulate when you can, or in other cases where you can't, you incent. The point is you need to know what kind of housing you want and need to attract the kind of employers you want and need in the locations where they want and need that housing to be. If you actually have a strategy that's based on that, you can achieve things. I doubt if I looked at all of your policies, sorry if I'm insulting any members of the planning department if they're here, but I doubt, and it's not really the planning department, it's usually driven by politicians, frankly, I have to say. So sorry to politicians current or past. But I doubt if I read everything in your city, I would see that vision I just suggested. I doubt I would see it. I probably would see something different, which suggests the policy and vision assumes everybody's going to drive between things. And you don't have the housing that necessarily matches the kind of people you're hoping to attract in the places that they will want to be. I think it's probably more driven by politicians who are afraid of angry citizens who will vote them out of office, so they're putting it in the least scary places that will be the least controversial, which is not the same thing. So, you know, it takes brave politicians. It takes being better at communicating a vision about why we need to do the unpopular thing for the future of our people. We're bad at making that case in many cases. And when we do try to put a vision out there, my profession, city planning, is often mind-numbingly boring and can't break through the noise, not good at working with the media, not persuasive in terms of communicating the need for the kinds of things I'm talking about. So I don't think the answer is hard. The answer about the kind of housing we need, the analysis that you can do, economic and otherwise, to tell you the kind of housing you need. Then you need the political bravery and the political will and the ability to communicate compellingly and persuasively the reason why you're going to do it, even if it's controversial. You need the guts to do it. The cities that are doing it are the cities with the guts to do it.
Hi. How do you ensure
Where are you?
Oh,
there.
how do you ensure high quality projects without making the process so onerous that you only end up with luxury projects by people with deep pockets?
I can't answer that question really quickly. I think there's all sorts of mechanisms for achieving quality. I will not guarantee you that they can be done in a super fast way, but I think the race to do things as fast as possible is one of the reasons why we have crappy projects. And we have this another false choice of fast versus good. You know, we can either be fast or we can be good. And because we're open for business, we want to be fast. I always say you should be just fast enough to have an outstanding result. And no faster than that, but no slower than that too. So you look at all of your systems to make sure that you don't have red tape that's wrong or slowing things down for no reason without a demonstrable connection to quality outcomes. And you preserve the red tape that isn't red tape, that's regulation and systems and processes that actually result in better outcomes. What scares me or infuriates me is the kind of lazy political narrative about, well, we have to cut red tape. I'm going to cut 50% of the regulations and rules because that's going to unleash the power of the private sector. I know, whenever I hear that, I know these people aren't serious about quality and they don't understand how to create value. That's usually an ideological dog whistle, right? So the cities that are doing it better and doing it right aren't the fastest, but they're also not incredibly slow. And they don't have stupid process. I call it churn. They don't have useless process that doesn't result in better outcomes. But I'm not going to cut process that leads to better outcomes just to be faster. I used to say to my staff, I'm not going to put on my tombstone that here lies a planner who approved crappy stuff, but he cut 20% process time.
We have time for one more question.
I'm here. I'm curious how you take the density you're supporting, especially I think the mid-rise is probably the most realistic in this sort of environment, and take into account wetlands, take into account conservation areas, streams, water bodies, et cetera. Clearly you showed examples of protecting the riverfront, which has a dual purpose of providing public access, but also protections with seawalls. But I'm curious, we have a lot of wetlands, we have a lot of environmental constraints in this area, and how do you deal with lot coverage? How do you suggest dealing with floor area ratios and things of that nature?
I find that question ironic because my first answer to a question like that is always to make better use of the land you're developing. In other words, density. The reason why North America has lost what percentage of its wetlands, something like 40 or 50%, I think the stat is because we're keeping doing that. And when we do that, every project fights over whether or not they should protect that what the riparian setback is, whether they protect the wetland or not, what classification of wetland it is. The only reason you're having that debate is because the development has reached that wetland. And it reaches that wetland because the density is too low. And as you grow, you're going out versus up. If you use land better, you don't even get to those new wetlands, that new stream, etc. Okay, so the reason you're even having those challenges is because you've been building too low, or one of the reasons. And then once you get to those things, you protect them. I have no problem, whether it's mid-rise or other form, then you do the right thing. Because, by the way, preserving and protecting natural things is one of the ways to make density successful. That's that amenity part, the livability and lovability of the density that I talked about. You sure as heck don't do higher density and then pave over the stream and destroy the wetland. Even if you were ignoring the fact that that wetland is critically important probably to your water source, the aquifer, all the other natural features and functions of a wetland. If all you cared about was amenity for human life, it makes density work better. Makes it more livable, lovable, and politically palatable. So you protect it. But you protect it because you've made better use of land in the first place. And I'm going to challenge you on the first part of your question. Sorry, I'm feeling kind of aggressive, I guess. I don't mean to. You said probably mid-rise is most realistic? Yes, in certain contexts. And by the way, when your whole downtown is mid-rise to me, I know you think it's high-rise. And I'm not saying you're wrong. Height is relative. You're right. In your context, it's high-rise. But every other place, that would be mid-rise. Outside your historic core, I asked a question of somebody today, who I won't say who, out in the mall, if that mid-rise form that I showed you, that housing at the corner had a 12-story tower, but it was slim, not slab-like, not big, slim. And maybe there was another one. And certainly I showed you what we're doing around transit in the suburban, no, it's not even suburban context anymore because it's urbanizing. Tell me what's wrong with a 12-story tower there. There's no historic context. There's no impact on a neighborhood. Tell me from a planning and public interest reason. I've been doing planning and public interest for 20 years, or 26 years. So tell me what the planning problem is, other than it's different than what you've been doing up till now. And the answer I got, and again, I'm not going to say who said it, was, well, it's that. It's different than what we've been doing. You've taken this ideology, frankly, that made a lot of sense in your historic core, and you've applied it everywhere else. Now, if you want that, then that's fine. Sometimes things are a simple choice. If you want that, that's fine. But there's no planning rationale for it. And there's a public interest reason to actually do it. Someone want to challenge? I'm not going to decide whether you can go again because you already asked a question. I'm going to let my host decide, depending on the other hands that have been up. Because I can tell you want to debate with me. Would anybody not ask a question who wanted to? Okay, go ahead.
Well, the issue is, I agree with you, everything you're saying, except for the issue of cost. Because if we're going to have a high-rise out there as a family, which I think is fine, because our school system is completely based on property taxes, if you're going to have a high-rise full of children, then that is going to add a lot of cost to the city. They're not going to pay for themselves, these new units, unless you can convince me otherwise. So
I don't need to convince you otherwise. Yeah. You need to convince your citizens that what you say is true. In my context that I've seen, I've never seen a place, unless the inherent land values are really low, which is not the case here. I've never seen a place where the costs of density are outpaced by the service needs. Well, I've seen every place the opposite. The costs of low density can't keep up with the infrastructure and servicing costs associated with it. So if you tell me that you can't afford density in a place that is property tax based, like here, I would need to see evidence of that.
It's just, in Portsmouth, we would be talking about a population increase if we were to do this. We're not taking people out of these suburbs and leveling their homes, I assume, and putting them in this tower. We're adding population.
Well, maybe. Listen, I can hear people murmuring,
Okay,
so I'll let them debate with
just
you
shut up.
after.
Yeah, all right.
You can, they can debate with you after, but I'll say one thing based on that. Maybe it is adding population, in which case, so? Did you guys decide you didn't want to have any more population? By the way, if a larger and larger percentage of your population are seniors who are not working and have high expectations for services, and if you're not attracting people who are coming in and actually generating employment and such, which reduces your tax base because property values go down, you're going to have a big economic problem. And other problems too, because all the seniors that live here probably hope that their kids and grandkids will be within at least driving distance. So there's a lot of implications to the idea that you don't want to add population. But even if that might not even be true, because what I found, and I did ask some questions today, what I find in most cities, and I was told today that it's true here too, is that in most of the areas, the population has been dropping. And not because of employment going down or anything, but because number of people per household is going down as the population ages. And that's largely because empty nesters aren't downsizing like we all assumed they would. And I've done exhaustive conversation and study on this issue in a few cities and talked about it with a lot of other cities. The assumption is that single detached house would go back on the market once the empty nesters, the seniors are empty nesters, because obviously the empty nesters will downsize. But then they didn't. And when we went out and actually asked them why, the primary answer was, well, because there's nothing to downsize to in our neighborhood, and we love our neighborhood. And if there were actually housing types in our neighborhood, new housing, smaller housing types, they would downsize and then free up the primary house to go back onto the market and maybe be bought by a family with kids. But because that isn't possible, because there's nothing to downsize to, they stay put until they pass away. Now, eventually, this problem will solve itself. I hate to put it like that, but in the meantime, the downsizing isn't happening, and communities are depopulating. What really concerns me about that is because the kids in particular, as a number, are really going down, all the school boards who are remarkably bad at planning, because they're usually ideologically driven about lowering costs, are putting the schools under threat of closure because the kid numbers are down. Is that happening here? Now, the thing they're not factoring in is as soon as those empty nesters do pass away, the kids could come back, but they won't come back if the school is closed. You see what I mean? So this is a critical need where, ironically, new housing types are the solution. And yet when you have an initial conversation, it's don't allow those housing types in there because they'll destabilize the neighborhood. I go out into communities and have in Vancouver and other places and said, I'll show you all the things that are actually happening in your neighborhood because I've been listening. The school's under threat of closure. The retail may be under threat of closure. You're certainly not, if you're asking me, by the way, why you don't have a grocery store in your neighborhood at the same time as you're fighting density, I can help you connect those dots. So if you actually have that conversation with them, that's how we got gentle, hidden, and invisible density through. Because we had those real-life conversations about what's really happening in communities. But often I find the conversation about change in communities, the political conversation, is not nearly that sophisticated, so you get a very unsophisticated answer. Are we done? Okay.